Okay guys, grab a seat, we'll make a start. A bit loud. Okay. Week 6. So we just get the elephant out of the room. How did the exam go? Or is anybody still speaking to me? Few. Yeah, that's alright, a couple not. That's okay. So look, I've had a quick glance through the results. I'm hoping that today I'll just go through, just to make sure it's all gone through properly, and then you should get your results tonight, hopefully. Or tomorrow morning. Yeah, no, they're kind of like preliminary, so what I've got to go through now is check them, make sure everything's gone through. The mark that you get, I don't know why it shows you the mark, it's not meant to, but it does. Is not a percentage, that's out of the total score. Okay, so it'll work out, and what I'll do is I'll put the grade up so you'll see your grade. Now, from having a quick eyeball of it, it looks like people have done pretty well, so well done. Okay, what I would say to you, do not fall into the trap that a lot of other people have done. If you get a reasonably good grade mid-semester, taking your foot off the accelerator, and then hoping that you can scrape through with a really dodgy final exam. The final exam is going to be different. Okay, obviously you've done an online one where you click stuff. The final exam, you're going to have to write things down and you're going to have to explain things. Gone are the days where you get a mark for listing something. Okay, unless the question asks you to list something. What you need to do now is explain something, not just list one-word answers or one-sentence answers. If it's asking you for an explanation, discussion, outline, explore, critique, that means you need to write about stuff, okay? And you need to put it in a format that explains it, okay? So your final exam, from what you show me that you know in your mid-semester, from what I've seen, is good, okay? But your final exam gets you now to apply this and to write this down. Okay, the other thing is in your final exam you're going to get case studies where you're going to physically apply this to your case study. So now you're going to not just list, describe, you're going to have to actually put it in some kind of semblance of order. Think about priorities, think about management, explaining underlying pathophysiology, explaining the mechanisms of actions of different types of drug groups. Okay, so that's going to require a lot more effort. And you ain't going to have your notes or Google. okay, to help you in that one. So you need to keep going, keep revising this stuff, keep looking through it, keeping it fresh in your mind. Because remember, at the end of this couple of weeks, we're sending you out clinically to work with people. So you're going to need to know this stuff to manage some of the patients that you're dealing with, okay? And as I said to the third years, who are now all trembling because they can see the finish of their course, okay? This thing sneaks up on you before you know it. You're in charge. You're looking after. You're responsible, okay? So this stuff's got to start sticking a bit now, and you've got to start putting it in some kind of order that's usable clinically, so you can think about prioritising your management of your care. As I said to you the other week, you don't just get one patient nowadays, you get 5 to look after, all right? Because we love to challenge you and just chuck you in the deep end. So you've got to not just know the ins and outs of one patient, you've got to kind of know the ins and outs of 5. And they can change through your shift, because some will get discharged and you'll admit some, and then some will get really sick, and then others will be kicking off because they want this, that and the other doing. So you've got all the other difficulties of the wonderful job of nursing throws at you. Okay? So this stuff needs to be in there and usable, so you don't have to think too hard. It's in there, it's usable. Because you'll be thinking a lot harder about a lot of other things that crop up that you're dealing with daily basis when you work. Okay, so I'll try and get those results through for you tonight. If not, probably tomorrow. I've got to run the exam for the third years tomorrow. So I'll try and get it done tonight, and then I don't have to mess tomorrow. Okay? Did everybody do it? Has everybody done it? If anybody, and even if anybody's online listening, if anybody's not done the mid-semester, you need to email me. Let me know. Okay? All right. So, week 6. What we're going to do, continue the theme really. We're going to keep going on the musculoskeletal bones and muscles and degenerative disorders now. We're going to start looking at some of the mechanisms behind the drugs that we use to treat these disorders. Towards the end, I'll probably throw in some more stuff around pain relief as well, because I know you've done it previously, but it's good to recap. You're going to go out there, you're going to be dealing with people with different types of pain. We need to understand a little bit about some of those drugs and how they work. Okay, so we'll recap some of that stuff. Now, we spent a lot of time last week looking at a lot of acute stuff. We looked at fractures and we looked at all that kind of stuff, dislocations and all that. It's quite interesting, lots of gory pictures. This week, I'm afraid I haven't got a lot of gory pictures, just me talking about probably more chronic disorders, really. But it's a big problem, and you'll see a lot of people coming through with chronic long-term changes in muscles and bones and joints. People coming through with long-term issues around chronic pain as well. So that might be in the background. That might not be the thing that's brought them into hospital. There might be something else going on with them that's brought them into hospital. So we've got to think about how these things interact and what kind of other issues they throw up when we manage these patients. So, a couple of stats. A lot of people in Australia with bone, joint, pain type disorders. So when we talk about the bones, 6.1 million cases, okay, in Australia. That's a lot of people. When you think our population's around 28 million, that's a significant proportion of people. Obviously, we get people that are a bit sicker that come through hospitals, so our proportion that we'll see is again amplified because we get a lot of people with chronic long-term disease processes that need intervention in a hospital setting. So you'll see a lot more of this stuff. So it's a common problem, which is why we're going through it, okay? So, we've talked about a lot of this stuff last week. I'm going to go into more of the chronic side of things, talk to you a bit about acute pain and how we manage that, and the mechanisms behind the different drugs that we use for managing pain. But now we need to get into some of the more chronic but common conditions, things like rheumatoid arthritis, things like osteoarthritis, go through some of the things that we can use to treat those. Now, we went a little bit into bones and muscles and joints last week, so I've just chucked this on to remind you what we're talking about in terms of your skeleton and your bones. So 206 bones in the adult, between 650 and 700 and odd muscles, depending on how much detail we're going to. A lot of potential for a lot of problems. I mentioned to you last week some of the chronic conditions, and I haven't really got time to go through antibiotics and all that stuff again. I think you've done that previously. Okay, but treating infection in a bone is difficult, okay, because this is how your bone's made up. And because of the special way that your bone's made up, we don't physically get blood supply to all the different parts of the bone tissue. You've got little canals and connections. So fluid can run through it, but cells like red blood cells and stuff like that can't always get to it. So that means we've got a difficulty then getting things like white blood cells, which are the bits that fight off infection, and we're going to start all that stuff next week, going into detail, okay, about how your immune system works. You've got to get those things in there to fix stuff up. So when you damage your tissue and it starts to get infected, the normal process is to get inflammation going and get white blood cells into the area to sort it out. Very difficult to do in a bone. Okay? The other issue, because the blood supply isn't running all the way through the bone, it's very difficult to get drugs like antibiotics through the bone as well. So it can be very difficult when we get people who've got long-term infections, osteomyelitis within a bone. Okay? And that's why you'll see people with chronic long-term infections having to have surgery to get rid of bone that's dead or infected so that it doesn't carry on spreading through the bone and causing more problems. Sometimes they'll lose limbs because of the problem. Okay? And that's based around the way your bones are made up. Okay? So another bit of a close-up of the structure of a bone so you can see what I mean by getting difficult. There is blood supply in a bone. I know a couple of people got a bit confused about whether blood actually runs through bone. It does. You do have blood supply because you've still got to keep those cells that are inside the bone alive, but they don't physically reach everywhere. So you're moving gases and you're moving fluids, not necessarily blood, through bone tissue. Okay? So it's quite vascular, but you can't get it everywhere. We talked a bit about how you fix the things up when you break them. So we went through the stages of bone healing last week, and there's certain time frames involved in normal bone fractures and normal bone healing, generally speaking, before you can start to weight bear on a bone, before you've got some kind of callus that can support weight. It takes about 4 to 6 weeks. That's why you're normally in a cast for that period of time. After that, you need a few more months to strengthen it fully and get it back to how it was. That's the part where we're doing the remodeling. Okay? We talked about difficult fractures. We did case studies last week in your tubes on difficult fractures. Some of those take a lot longer to heal. Some of those never heal, okay, because you've disrupted the blood flow, etc., through the bone. But that's the normal process. Now, some of the conditions that we see, I've put a few other conditions on here this week, which we can talk about. You may have heard of rickets in kids, okay? Or you may have heard of osteomalacia in adults. They are basically two terms that describe the same condition. So rickets is used to describe a problem with bones from children's point of view, and for an adult, osteomalacia. Now basically, as we mentioned last week, your bones are a collagen network which are basically mineralized to give you strength. Running through it, you've got some blood supply, etc., etc. Okay? The way you make up bones is reasonably complex, but basically you're putting minerals in, strengthening it up, and then on occasions you're taking minerals out. And it's in flux. We mentioned this last week. Like everything in your body, that wonderful term homeostasis comes into play. Things are being kept in balance. And your bones are the same. At any one point in time, about 10% of your bone tissue is being remodeled. Okay, in other words, there's something nibbling away at your bones, and there's something building your bone up. Okay, and that's how you maintain levels of things like phosphates, things like calcium, magnesium, stuff like that in your blood. Okay, now to make your bones strong, you have to be able to absorb the right nutrients from your gut. Oh look, we did all about the gut in week 1 and week 2. Okay, so you know all about intestinal absorption and all that stuff. One of the things you might not be aware of is that you produce something called vitamin D. Now some of you have heard of vitamin D. You think about it in sunlight, you go out and sun yourself and you think, yeah, I'm making vitamin D. Because some of your skin cells produce vitamin D or a form of vitamin D from sunlight. Vitamin D in your body's got quite a lot of different roles to do with your immune system. But one of the big things that it does for you is that it helps you to absorb calcium from your small intestine. Okay? So to get calcium into your body, you need available amounts of vitamin D. Now vitamin D, you constantly produce a form of it, but that's not the right type of vitamin D. Vitamin D actually needs to go through your liver and through your kidneys to be changed into the useful form of vitamin D. Okay? Now in some cases people lack either vitamin D that you produce from sunlight, or vitamin D that you get from your diet, or levels of calcium are low in your body, or levels of phosphate, etc. are low in your body. Okay? That gives you a problem with mineralizing your bone. Okay? We talked, I think, in week 1 and 2 about things like colostomies and ileostomies. Depending on what part of your bowel we take away, how much of it, depends on how well you're going to absorb things like calcium. Okay? And whether you're now going to have a problem with calcium levels in your blood. So with osteomalacia or rickets in kids, what's happening basically is you've got a lack of mineralization of the bone, generally due to a lack of things like vitamin D. Okay? No vitamin D or not enough vitamin D, then you can't pull in the calcium that you require to keep your bones nice and healthy, strong. Okay? So what you'll find, and particularly kids have very soft bones because they're growing, okay, is in children like this little kid here, the bones can soften to a point where they can't take the weight and they start to bow. Okay? And that's a sign of malnutrition, and particularly rickets or osteomalacia, vitamin D, calcium deficiencies. And you see it a lot in malnourished children. Okay, we still get it in Australia. Even though we are a developed country, there are parts of Australia where we have people who aren't well nourished. Okay, so we still see this in kids and we see it in adults. There are other disease processes that affect how you produce vitamin D, how you metabolize it and switch it on. If your kidneys are damaged, for example, you have a problem switching on vitamin D. That can give you a problem with your bones. So people with things like renal disorders can have problems with calcium, metabolism, etc., in their bones. So there's a lot of knock-on effects. Okay? Where do you get your vitamin D from? Well, most of us think about either eating stuff that's got it in, or sunlight, okay, which is about the right places where we get things from. Okay? Obviously the process of how it's switched on, and I'll show you another more complicated slide, is a bit more complex. But for us, what we need to know is you need this stuff. It helps you absorb things, and it helps you to make your bones and keep your bones strong. Okay? And there's an issue with demineralization of your bones if you can't use this stuff. So, what do we do about it? Well, basically, if it's a mild form of osteomalacia, which tends to affect the adult population, okay, then we can do things like change your lifestyle. You can get out in the sun a bit more. Okay? You can eat the right types of foods. You can take foods with more calcium in them, etc., etc. We can supplement the levels of calcium that you're getting in. We can supplement your levels of vitamin D. So we can do things like that, and that's generally how we go about fixing it. If you've actually got a deformity of your bone, then there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, we have to stop the problem that's causing the deformity of your bone, the osteomalacia or the rickets. But then we have to go about fixing the bones up and straightening them up, and that involves a lot more stuff, a lot more surgeries, etc., etc. Okay? But the general fix for these types of patients is to increase the diet, intakes of calcium, increase the dietary intake of vitamin D. Okay? As I mentioned to you before, you've probably heard this one, vitamin D, you can get the supplements in the chemist, is also to do with how your white blood cells function. So you need some form of vitamin D to make your white blood cells do their job and fight off infections. So it does have a link to your immune system, and that's why they push things like vitamin D, vitamin C, when you've got colds and coughs and all that kind of stuff. Okay? That's the more complex one. Look at the names. I can't even spell it, never mind say it. Okay? So, we've got different forms of vitamin D. They get changed, they do their job, things work. Okay? That's all we need to know. So for patients that are lacking it, we can give you stuff. Different forms is inactivated vitamin D, which you swallow, gets absorbed, goes through your liver, through your kidneys, gets activated and works. If you've got damaged kidneys, we can actually give you an active form, so we don't need your kidneys to switch it on. So there's different forms, there's different ways of giving it, and there's different things also in terms of supplementing your diet, etc., that we need to do to keep your bones healthy. So that's the osteomalacia. Now, you've probably all heard of osteoporosis. Who's looked after anybody, a patient with osteoporosis? A few of you, okay? Very common, particularly in women, particularly in older women. Now, osteoporosis is a similar kind of process where you've got a problem with the mineralization of your bone. The mineral content of bone gives you the compactile force, okay, resistance. So that's the thing that gives you the strength of your bones. As you demineralize a bone, it becomes more fragile, and therefore you've got more risk of fractures. If you start breaking bones, we talked about fractures last week, there are a lot of issues that come from breaking bones, not just the actual pain, etc., and the inconvenience of breaking your bone, okay, and the blood loss, but also then the changes in how you mobilize, the changes of you being stuck in hospital, etc., having to have surgery, and all the risks that go with all that stuff. So osteoporosis isn't just a problem with having bones that are fragile, it's all the other risks that come when you start fracturing bones more frequently, and particularly when you're older. Because if you start to break bones when you're older, it can really decondition you. And that can literally be the difference between life and death in some older people. As soon as you start making them immobile, then they decondition very quickly, which means then they lose function very quickly. And some of those will not recover that function, and therefore breaking their hip, for example, will end up killing them. Okay? So we need to be aware of these issues, osteoporosis being one of the number ones. So we've got basically an abnormality in how we mineralize the bones. We've got an abnormality between two different types of cells in your bones. One called osteoblasts and one called osteoclasts. Okay? Now one builds up the bone, mineralizes it, osteoblasts, and one nibbles away at the bone, breaks it down and releases calcium into your blood, osteoclasts. Normally the two balance out. In osteoporosis, you get a difference. The osteoblasts don't work as well. So you get less mineralization and more breakdown of bone. Now you've got an imbalance. There are things that cause that, factors that cause it. Okay? Hereditary, you're more at risk if you've got people who've got osteoporosis in the family. Women, less bone density to start with, less mineralization to start with. Estrogen is highly protective, particularly for women, with a lot of different things. Cardiovascular disease, risk of cancers and stuff like bone density. Estrogen's quite protective. When you reach menopause, you reduce your levels of estrogen, so that causes you a problem. One of the things that estrogen does in your bones is it slows down the activity of osteoclasts and makes sure osteoblasts are doing their job and building up the bone. When you lose the estrogen, you get the imbalance. Okay? So, there's a few things going on. There's other issues as well that you can get that can cause osteoporosis. Changes with the hormones. We did all like week 3 and 4. You remember the two hormones, one called calcitonin, one called parathyroid hormone. Okay? These things regulate the build-up and breakdown of your bone. You get imbalances in those. Thyroid dysfunction can cause problems with bones. Long-term use of drugs like steroids can cause problems with bone mineralization. and your risk of osteoporosis goes up. Risk factors. Alcohol. Alcohol, not sure why, to do with perhaps things like how your liver works, things like how vitamin D works in your liver, etc., and all that stuff, but also things like how alcohol affects your liver and the normal processes that can be protective of your body. Okay? Steroids was mentioned, not getting enough calcium in your diet, changes in your estrogen levels. Smoking's related to everything. Okay? Smoking's just bad, full stop. Okay? Toxins, carcinogens, changes in how your cells function, changes in how your immune system functions, etc., etc. Okay? And sedentary lifestyle, the less weight you put through a bone, the less hard osteoblasts work. Okay? So if you start taking it easy and not putting weight through your bones, the osteoblasts put the feet up and take a break as well. That means the bone gets thinner. Okay? More fragile. So there's a few risk factors. Look at that, it's a beautiful diagram. Okay? So this is just showing you all the different things that can impact in how your bones are made up and how they stay nice and healthy. Okay? All of these things together give you a nice quality of bone, volume of bone, strength, all that kind of stuff. That's what that's all about. Okay? This is to show you the nibbling effect, how these different cells are working. Osteoblasts build things up. Osteoclasts break things down. What happens in osteoporosis is the osteoclasts are left to do whatever they like, and the osteoblasts put their feet up. Okay? So now you've got an imbalance in bone build up and breakdown. You break down bone more than you build it up. So you demineralize thinner bones. How do we prevent it? Well, lifestyle factors are always the easiest things to adjust first off. So if you've got people who are at risk, not necessarily have osteoporosis, so women who are getting older, who've gone through menopause, then there are certain things we should be recommending. You shouldn't smoke, you should drink in moderation, you should potentially do more exercise to keep yourself healthy, weight bearing on your bones. All of those things are useful. Okay? You might have higher risk because you've got stuff in the family or you've had fractures in the past. So now we might recommend taking supplements, taking more calcium, taking more vitamin D to make those bones nice and strong and healthy, reduce your risk of fractures. Okay? There may be medications that you're taking for other disease processes that are going on that might also increase your risk. So we need to factor those in. Okay? And think about other medications then we can use to reduce this process of breaking your bone down. So, drugs. There's a few different types of drugs that we use to try and rebalance the process. Okay? Now, biphosphonates, I don't know if you've ever heard of these things before, they're fairly common. You'll see people on stuff like Fosamax and other types of these biphosphonates. Now what these things are basically are off switches for osteoclasts. You build them into the bone. As the osteoclast comes along and starts to nibble away at the bone with the biphosphonate in it, it basically tells the osteoclast to turn off, slow down, chill out. Okay? So it reduces the bone breakdown. Therefore, you get less bone breakdown and the mineral density stays where it is. Okay? So these biphosphonates are something you'll see commonly given now, particularly to older women. Slow down, stop this natural process where you dissolve the bone. Okay? Also, you'll see them used, and we mentioned, I think, last week, something called Paget's disease. Paget's disease is a similar kind of process where you've got abnormal breakdown and makeup of bones. And the biphosphonates will slow that process as well. Okay? Much more common for people with osteoporosis. Yep. Low quality bone just means stuff that's fragile. It's not well made up. Okay? It's got holes in it, basically. So it won't take the compactile force that a normal bone would take, so it's therefore low quality. Okay. All right. So if you're slowing down the resorption of bone, then the side effect of that is sometimes you can now induce problems with homeostasis of things like your electrolytes, because you need calcium and you need phosphate and you need magnesium and all the other stuff that's kept in your bones, in your blood as well. So if you slow down the process of this being released, now you can get abnormalities in the blood and other tissues, okay, which is what all this stuff's going on about there. So we have to keep a close eye on people. They might need to supplement, take extra things in the diet to increase the circulating levels of these electrolytes, because you're switching off the normal process or slowing down the normal process, which would help you regulate those levels. Okay? Now, estrogen, we've mentioned before, men and women produce estrogen. Estrogen in women obviously is more to do with the uterus and menstruation and thickening of the uterus and all the other stuff, growth of breast tissue, etc., etc. In blokes, you need estrogen also for maturation of things like sperm and sperm production. Okay, but blokes use more testosterone for other things as well. Now, in women, as you reach menopause and you produce less estrogen, you get less of those protective effects of estrogen. So people thought, well, what we should do then is just replace. When you reach menopause, we'll give you a tablet with estrogen and progesterone in and replace everything and you'll be back to normal. The problem with that is, as you age, tissues change, and those estrogens can actually stimulate growth, particularly in things like breast tissue. And as you get older, you're more at risk of cancers in breast tissue. And what the estrogens do to cancers in breast tissue is tell them to grow faster. So it increases your risk of breast cancers. So what they've had to do is come up with a modified type of estrogen, which has good effects on your bone, but doesn't have the drawbacks of increasing things like breast cancers risk. Okay? So these are the selective estrogen receptor modulators, SERMs. Okay? Think about the normal processes. Normal way you maintain bone in women is for estrogen to make your osteoblasts build the bone a bit faster. These things do the same. So we can give you biphosphonates to slow down the breakdown, and we can give you selective estrogens to increase the build-up. So we actually start to mineralize your bone, make it stronger. Okay? Riloxafen is this designer one. You might have heard of this one. It's been in the news a bit as well. And it's also used to slow down breast cancers. Okay? Because it actually blocks the receptor on a breast cancer that makes it grow. So there's different uses, but basically useful to try and reduce breakdown of bone and increase build-up of bone. Okay? I stuck that on so you can see the difference between HRT, hormone replacement therapies, and these selective estrogens. Slight differences. Don't worry too much. Don't need to know it. So if you're interested. Calcitonin. Heard of this stuff before? Hormone. Covered this one in the old endocrine bit, didn't we? Okay, so calcitonin is one of the hormones that's produced from your thyroid gland, specialized cells in your thyroid gland. This stuff tells your bones to build, to get bigger, to take more minerals in. So you pull in calcium from your blood into your bone to mineralize it, make your bones stronger. So you can use that as a hormone. It's not quite as effective, it's a bit slower, but that can give you a background. Okay? And hormone replacement therapy, they've kind of got rid of now in a lot of cases. It used to be very common about 10, 20 years ago, a lot of people on this stuff. But because of the side effects of it, because of the breast cancers, it also seems to increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, and all that other stuff. So they've kind of said last resort stuff, really, for hormone replacement. So they use other things instead now. Okay? All right. Osteomalacia, rickets, done. Osteoporosis, done. Any questions so far? Silence. Okay. Osteoarthritis, we spent a bit of time talking about this last week. Wear and tear on your joints. Okay? So this is the one where basically the more you use a joint, the more likely it is to get damaged. The cartilage in the joint makes it nice and smooth. Once you start to damage, wear down the cartilage, it can crack. Once it cracks, the fluid can get into different places. You can get cysts, you can get overgrowth of tissue, you can get bones growing into the joint. And eventually, you wear away the cartilage, now you've got bone on bone. Lots of inflammation, lots of pain, stiff, dodgy joints. Okay? So we talked about joint replacement and all that stuff last week. Okay? So ideally, with osteoarthritis, and this is the problem, you don't get the signs and symptoms with a lot of these diseases, like osteoarthritis, until it's fairly well developed. So what we've got to try and do is give people preventative strategies beforehand, so lifestyle changes and all that kind of stuff. Lose weight, improve strength around the joints or muscle strength, all that kind of stuff. So exercise is really important. Okay? Exercise does a lot of good in your body, increases lots of different things, and improves things. If we can't deal with the problem just through lifestyle changes, then we have to start, quite often we will start using some types of medications to control things. So when we think about osteoarthritis, the key part that we pick up on with patients with these changes is pain and inflammation and swelling, okay, in these joints. They'll come out with other signs and symptoms, cracking joints, stiffness in the joints, all that kind of stuff. So what we tend to do is aim with our strategies to manage this, first of all, trying to reduce the inflammatory process that goes on, and then trying to also stop the pain that's going on, which then will hopefully allow us to start the process of healing up the joint a bit more. So, pain relief. Thought I'd chuck some slides in here, talk to you again about pain relief. Now, let's have a look. How many of you have given patients analgesics, pain-relieving medications? A few of you looking around going, oh God, yeah, I think I have. All right? So have you all doled out stuff like paracetamol, ibuprofen, okay, all of those different ones? Then you'll have gone into stuff like, I don't know, you might have been giving patients, I don't think you lot are allowed to give the S8s and all that stuff, the S4s and stuff. But you might have seen patients on those types of different drugs as well. So we'll talk about how they work so you understand the mechanism. Did you go through the pain control theory, the gate theory, Melzack and Wall's gate theory of pain and all that nonsense? Talk about that? Can you remember anything on pain? A little bit. Okay. So there are different theories of how pain works in your body. Okay, but generally speaking, the normal theory is when you damage a tissue, the stimulus that's damaging a tissue is called a noxious stimulus. Okay? And a noxious stimulus basically damages your cells enough for them to start to leak stuff. And they leak things that signal other cells and nerve pathways that it's damaged. That's what pain is. Okay? It's a physiological response to damage. So you're signaling, and you're using different chemicals and different substances. Okay, cytokines, substance P, prostaglandins, other things, like a chemical soup. All right, that stimulates a nerve called a nociceptor. You heard of those? God, it's one of those, is it? So nociceptors signal your nerve pathways. Nerve pathway generally runs peripherally into your central nervous system. From your central nervous system, okay, you've got a system where you basically interpret pain at the level of your spinal cord, believe it or not. And what happens there is the signal reaches your spinal cord. There's a decision made there of whether the signal gets into your spinal cord and then heads up to your brain. Goes through your brainstem thalamus, which is the switchboard of your brain, and it's sent to the right centers of your brain, so eventually you go, ouch. Okay? You get an awareness of pain. Now, these signaling pathways, and this Melzack and Wall people, they said there's a gateway in your spinal cord, which basically means that you're using the same nerve pathways, the nerves that would signal temperature, friction, pressure, okay? Which is why, if you think about this, if you hurt yourself, like you bang, you scrape your knee or something like that, one of the first things you tend to do is grab it and start rubbing it, okay? Why are you grabbing and rubbing an area that you've just damaged? Because you're using Melzack and Wall's gate theory of pain. What you're doing is you're sending more intense stimulus down the same nerve pathway, which will signal rubbing, friction, pressure, heat. And at the spinal cord, your spinal cord has a decision to make, and it will send the signal with the most intensity. If it's pain that's intense, that goes to your brain. If it's you rubbing your shoulder or your elbow like getting stuck in there, it'll send that signal. So what you do is you modify this gateway. You open the gate or you close the gate. Okay? Now with drugs, we can modify those signals. We can modify signals at the site of injury, or we can modify signals along the nerve pathway. I can modify signals at your spinal cord level, or I can modify signals in your brain. Okay, this is how painkillers work. Yeah.
How is it some people have higher pain tolerance than others?
That's a good question. Nobody really knows why some people can tolerate pain more than others. Everybody's got slightly different tolerances to do with probably nerve thresholds and all that stuff, way beyond my pay grade. Okay? This is the theory of how it works. So if you understand this gate control, then you'll understand how all the different types of painkillers, analgesics that you're giving to your patients work. Okay? Because you're modulating pathways, different parts of this system, okay, of how you signal things. So, have you seen this step-by-step analgesic ladder? The World Health Organization's analgesic ladder. They recommend taking different steps when you're controlling people's pain. Have you heard of this before? Yeah? Okay. So, when we look at pain relief, when we look at analgesics, okay, or drugs that we use to modify pain, there are different types. We talk about non-opiate or non-opioid, okay, or what we would classify, some people will call them weaker analgesics, okay. Then as you take a step up, you go into the categories around things like opiates and opioids, and generally what we classify as the weaker opiates and opioids. And then as you take a final step up, you get on the rung, if you like, that's got your full-on, powerful opiates and opioid medications. Okay? Now, they work in different ways. I'll go through these in a second with you, different parts of this pathway. But it's important that you know that picking one over another isn't always the best option. The best option sometimes is combining different pathways. Okay? Remember we talked about antiemetics having different effects in different areas. Same with the analgesics. So even though you think, well, paracetamol, okay, why would I give somebody who's fractured their leg paracetamol? Okay, they should have this one instead. Actually, you should give both together because they'll have different pathways, different mechanisms, different effects. Okay, so analgesics. Now, generally speaking, most of the patients that you'll have come across, you'll have probably given them oral analgesics, tablets that they swallow, capsules that they swallow. Okay, and the general ones that you will probably likely have been given are things like, first of all, paracetamol. Now, paracetamol is a slight mystery drug. Okay, nobody really knows how paracetamol properly works. Okay, it just does. We think it's to do with a certain pathway with prostaglandins and to do with the COX enzyme. We think it works more centrally than peripherally. Okay, but the actual mechanism cellularly of how this stuff works is still a bit of a mystery, but it's a very effective analgesic. And it's a reasonably safe analgesic as long as you follow the instructions. Okay, so paracetamol is a drug that works reasonably quickly after you give it orally. It takes about half an hour, starts to work, got an action of about 4 to 6 hours. Okay, so it'll give you a nice background of pain relief. You can give IV paracetamol. Have you seen that now? You know, bags of paracetamol. That's quite interesting because inside the bag is something else. Have you ever looked at the bag? Besides liquid, I know you're going to say there's water in there as well, Steve. Yes, I know that. There's something called N-acetylcysteine in there. What the hell? Okay. So N-acetylcysteine is the stuff that your liver produces that helps you to detoxify paracetamol. Because if you take too much of this stuff, it will kill you. Okay, even though you can go in Boots and Coles and wherever else and buy it over the counter, okay, this stuff is toxic to your liver above a certain dose. So once you start to get above 4 grams a day, you're starting to knock off your liver function. Okay, there's a risk of that. So that's why we need to follow the instructions, because you only produce so much of this acetylcysteine in a 24-hour period, which is the stuff that detoxifies paracetamol. Okay? So, useful, very good, what we would classify as a normal type of weak analgesic. It's pretty good stuff. Okay? What you shouldn't do when you pick up a drug chart is go, well, I'm going to give this guy morphine, so I'm not going to bother giving him the paracetamol. You give the two together because they work in different ways, different pathways. Alright, so if they're written up for a regular dose of the stuff, still give it. Give whatever else you need to manage the pain. Alright. The other things you may well have been doling out to people are things like non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Okay, so stuff like ibuprofen, diclofenac, indomethacin, aspirin. Okay, are all what we call non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Now these tend to work peripherally at the site of action. Okay, they do have some central effects as well, but generally speaking, the site of action is peripherally. So when you damage the tissue and it's releasing these chemicals, okay, this chemical soup, all these cytokines, substance P and all this other stuff, one of the things that happens at the site of injury is you start to switch on an enzyme pathway called the COX enzyme. Remember that thing? Cyclooxygenase. Okay, now this stuff changes different chemicals in the pathway and produces pain-producing chemicals, prostaglandins. Okay? Those prostaglandins signal your nociceptors and other cells that there's damage, and it sends the pain signal through your peripheral nervous system up to your brain, saying you go, ouch. Okay? So generally speaking, what we do with a non-steroidal is we give you that drug, works at the site of injury, and it blocks the COX enzyme, which reduces the inflammatory process and reduces the pain signaling chemicals that you produce. That's how you get pain relief. That's why it's a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. It reduces the inflammatory process. Okay? They do have central effects as well, the non-steroidals, so they will impact on your thermostat of your brain, which is the hypothalamus. So when you get fevers and things like that, you can give paracetamol as well, similar effect. Changes the way the thermostat works, your hypothalamus, and it resets your core temperature, okay, which reduces the temperature. So it's good in fevers, okay. So is paracetamol. That's how paracetamol reduces temperature, okay. Its effects on prostaglandins in the brain centrally. All right. Very good drugs for osteoarthritis, very good drugs to control inflammation in joints, very good drugs to control inflammation generally. But there are side effects because we've talked about other types of prostaglandins which your body produces, which do things like protect your stomach. Okay, remember those ones that make the mucus that protects your stomach? You have prostaglandins that increase renal blood flow. You have prostaglandins that increase bronchodilation. You have prostaglandins that produce increased blood flow through your coronary arteries. So there's effects from giving non-steroidals in some patient groups, okay, at risk of other things. Another wonderful diagram just to show you those different pathways, okay? So there are different types of COX inhibitors. There's the general ones that knock off both COX-1 and COX-2 enzymes, and then there are more selective ones, okay, which look at the COX-2 enzyme. Pain relief. Okay? This is kind of revision. Is it making any sense? Sort of. All right, there's another wonderful picture as well. So that's showing you the processes. That's the kind of the chemical soup that's being released and all the effects of those different types of prostaglandins. Some are protective, some are pro-inflammatory and create pain. Okay? And another one. Okay. Let's get rid of that one quickly. So, steroids. We can use these as well in terms of arthritis, particularly things like osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis, to reduce inflammation. Steroids work differently. Steroids have got lots of effects, okay? But the steroid effect is generally on your white blood cells and your immune system. So it reduces the inflammatory process by basically telling your white blood cells to chill out, okay? So when you get an inflammatory process from damaged cells, your white blood cells come along and the steroids calm that process down. And they basically switch off the white blood cells to an extent, stop them getting involved, stop them kicking off, creating more inflammation and pain. So that's how steroids work. In terms of things like joints, you can inject steroids directly into a joint. You've probably seen creams where you can rub stuff onto your skin and it gets absorbed through the skin and some cutaneous layers and it can affect that way. So you can have topical steroids. You can have oral steroids. We talked about some of them the other week. Okay, and you can inject directly either into the vein, so you can have IV steroids, or into the site, like a topical injection into the joint itself. So you'll see all these footballers and people like that who've got lots of inflammation because they've strained or sprained a joint, and they'll start to have injections so they can carry on playing, etc. Okay, so that's how these work. Around a joint, as well as tendons and ligaments, the joint capsule itself, you have stuff called bursas as well, which are like padding. Best way to think about them. They're quite slick and they allow things like tendons to slide across them. So they give you a bit of padding around a joint, inside a joint, and allow things to move more freely. They can get inflamed. So sometimes you'll see people with bursitis and they'll get injections into those joints as well, into the bursas. Okay? Now, I don't know if I've got any slides on the other types of analgesics, so I'll just very quickly mention them. So you've probably seen the opiates and opioids, which are the S4s and the S8s. Okay? An opiate is slightly different to an opioid. An opiate is your original form of things like morphine. Okay, so it comes from the opium plant. Opioids are synthetic drugs that are manufactured to have similar effects to opiates. Okay, so in the S8 cupboards, generally speaking, is where we keep a lot of that stuff. They are reasonably potent. Okay, and we usually compare the potency of them to things like morphine. But basically, the site of action for morphine generally is central. It works in your spinal cord, where that gate's opening, closing, and it works in your brain. And you modify receptors, opiate receptors. In other words, basically, it doesn't do anything to the pain, it doesn't do anything to the process of inflammation or the damage that's occurring. It just tells your central nervous system basically to ignore it. Okay? So that's how opiates tend to work. They interfere with the processing of the signal. Opiate receptors in your brain make you feel very nice, thanks very much, okay? But it basically closes down the awareness of pain. It can give you euphoria. The downside, I suppose, is you've also got opiate receptors in your brain stem, and your brain stem controls things like your breathing, and your heart rate and your blood pressure. So opiates can have an effect particularly on your respiratory center, which controls your respiratory rate, depth, effort of breathing. So too much of this stuff stops your breathing, okay, which is how people generally die from overdose. Opiates will also cause a bit of vasodilation. They'll make your blood vessels open up, okay? So you'll see people sometimes, and particularly if they've got opiates being put in through epidurals, the epidural, the nerve block, as well as the opiate, can cause vasodilation. And so the blood pressure disappears when they've got an epidural. They get a low blood pressure. So that's something to be aware of. Okay? The different types out there, morphine we tend to have. We don't use it as much now as we used to do. Fentanyl is very common now. Fentanyl is about 100 times more potent than morphine, so we give that in micrograms. Okay? We've got different versions of fentanyls. Other stuff that's out there, is there any other stuff that you've heard of? Tramadol, have you seen that? Heard of that? So tramadol is a synthetic opiate. It's got different effects. Okay, it's also good at lifting mood. So there's a few different types in the cupboard out there. Okay? They're what we call the strong painkillers. Right? You need to know a little bit about how long they work for, and how long they take to work, because quite often some of those are fairly quick acting. They're in the system, they work quickly, give you good pain relief, but they wear off reasonably quickly. Okay? So that's why you need to give the other types of painkillers to give you some background as well. Okay? And there's different types of modified release drugs. So you'll see tramadol that's slow release, you'll see tramadol, for example, that's immediate release. So you get the two different effects. It depends on who's prescribing, to be honest, and what they're prescribing for. So everybody's different. You'll find patients coming out with PCAs with morphine. You'll find patients coming out with PCAs with fentanyl. You'll find patients coming out with no PCAs and they'll have a nerve block instead. But I'll talk to you about nerve blocks. Okay, so it all depends on whoever's. But the problem for you as a nurse is you've got to know a bit about everything because you don't know what they're going to get. Okay? So that's why we've got to be aware of all of it to an extent, what it is, how it works. Okay? So that's the steroid and the analgesics, basically. Other things that people do to joints, well, you can have injections of this hyaluronic acid into your joints. This is stuff you naturally produce. It keeps your joints nice and lubricated, gives your cartilage a bit of nutrition, support that way. So sometimes you can get injections of that put into a joint to try and overcome things like osteoarthritis, okay, in the joint. Okay, I think, is there any questions? We'll have a quick 5. Stretch your legs. Do you want to do it now? Hang on, guys, just before you leg it, just for a second, can I have your attention? One of your colleagues wishes to talk to you. Who's that? There you go, it's all yours.
Cool. Hi. Oh, okay, loud. Just wanted to let you guys know, I'm Dragana. I'm part of the team going to Vietnam, and as I'm sure you know, we have loads of fundraising events going on, one of which is a quiz night. So it's on a Thursday, not this Thursday, but next Thursday, the 14th of September, at 6:30 at the Orient. Tickets are $15. It's super, super fun. I wrote the quiz. And there's like prizes up for grabs and stuff. So if you would like to come, please do. Just let me know. You can like buy tickets online, or like you can do it in person, or like whatever. We'll sort it out. But yes, quiz night, 14th of September, 6:30. Please come. Thanks.
Okay, thanks guys. Go and have a stretch your legs. Okay, guys online, can you still hear me? I'm going to start again. Perfect, thank you. Okay. Let's carry on. I know you're loving it. Alright, so as a recap, we're talking about bones and joints again, and we're talking about chronic disorders really today, talking about drugs that influence the management of these chronic disorders. So we've talked about a few different things so far. So we've gone through osteomalacia, we've gone through osteoporosis, gone through osteoarthritis, and then we've talked a bit about pain relief as well, and steroids and actions that way. So another common condition, an important one again you'll come across reasonably frequently, is rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, so slightly different, still an arthritis. So arthritis is talking about inflammation, changes in a joint. Okay, so rheumatoid arthritis we went through a bit last week. Chronic long-term condition, inflammatory process where you get changes in the joint, and it's usually brought on because it's an autoimmune disease by your body attacking its own tissues. Okay, when you start to attack your own tissues, your immune system kicks off. You start to produce antibodies. Those antibodies start to damage and attract more white blood cells, which create more inflammation and more changes and damage that way. Okay? So, changes that go on in the joint with rheumatoid, lots of inflammation, overgrowth of tissue, that can change the shape of the joint, dislocate the joint in some circumstances. You get this pannus growth into the joint. So lots of things changing. Lots of pain, lots of inflammation. Everything as well, like we've said with every condition, you've got mild, moderate, severe. You can get flare-ups of rheumatoid arthritis, and you can get periods of remission where it kind of settles down and people can manage it and live no problem. So it depends on the person, on the severity in terms of the effects. It can be very debilitating, and basically people can be bedridden because of rheumatoid arthritis. So, yeah. What decides? We don't know. Again, it's one of those, we don't understand why some people get a more severe flare-up, why others don't. There are conditions which make you more prone to it, but there's no reason why one person would be more affected than a different person. So, treatment, generally speaking, of rheumatoid arthritis is to change the underlying inflammatory process that's occurring within the joint. Okay? Now, generally speaking, if it's a mild problem at this point, you can use some of the drugs we've already talked about, analgesics, okay, things like paracetamol to reduce the pain. Okay, you can use non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs to try and reduce the inflammatory process within the joint. Okay, and there's specific types of non-steroidals as well, which tend to accumulate within synovial fluid. So we'll cover some of those when we do your tubes, I think, this week. Steroids, your body produces normally steroid as well, okay, but we can add in steroids, okay, corticosteroids or glucocorticoids, depends on which books you read, okay, they're the same thing. These things, as we've said before, their aim is anti-inflammatory. It works on your immune system, suppresses your immune system, reduces the amount of inflammatory mediators that are being produced, and therefore settles down the process. So you'll see people on oral steroids, things like prednisolone or prednisone, okay, that they'll take as a dose every day to try and keep on top of this chronic inflammatory process. Long-term effects of steroids, well, steroids dampen down your immune system. So there are consequences to that. Okay? Steroids influence the way your bones and the osteoblasts and osteoclasts work. Consequences to that. Okay? Changes the way you metabolize, move fats and carbohydrates around your body. Okay? Blood flow is altered with different steroids. Those are the consequences that you see. Steroids increase your blood sugar, all the other things that go along with high blood sugar levels, etc., etc. So steroids are not risk-free drugs, okay? And there's long-term effects from those. Now, we've mentioned the non-steroidals. just to go through some of the side effects of non-steroidals. They're very useful anti-inflammatory drugs. The problem is that some of them are not very discriminative. They'll knock out COX-1 and COX-2, and you need prostaglandins in your body. If you start to take these non-steroidals for too long, then potentially the risks go up. Okay, so you need, as we've mentioned before, prostaglandins to control your protection of your stomach. You need prostaglandins to protect renal blood flow, to protect your heart and blood flow through your heart, etc., etc. So if you start to use these long term and people start to get problems, then you can start to see changes in the function of other organs. So things like renal impairment, okay, peptic ulcers, gastritis, those types of issues can occur. Bleeding. Okay, so there's lots of knock-on effects. Non-steroidals and prostaglandins are also important in clotting and platelet activation. We'll get stuck into all that next week. I know you just can't wait to go through the clotting cascade. Okay? But there are effects on that system as well. Okay? Nothing's ever straightforward and nothing's ever risk-free that we do to patients. So we might need to think about different mechanisms, different drugs that are safer, less side effects long-term for people with things like rheumatoid arthritis. And they've come up with a group of drugs which they call disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, DMARDs. Okay? Now I'm going to show you some of these. They are complex. I don't need you to know the complexity. I'm showing you out of interest, and so you know it's complex, so you're not complacent about it. Okay? But you don't need to know the ins and outs of every single drug. You need to know the basics of what these things do, and I'll tell you what the basics are as we go through. Okay? But there are some weird and wonderful drugs that we give to patients which seem to have a positive effect on things like inflammation and rheumatoid arthritis. Okay? They are not instant fixes, a lot of these. So they take a while to have their effect, sometimes weeks, sometimes months before they actually start to work. So it's not an instant fix, and it's something that will be guided by a specialist in these areas, a rheumatologist, somebody like that. You won't just turn up to your GP and they'll start prescribing a lot of this stuff. Okay? Because some of it's got adverse effects as well. Now, gold, the old bling stuff that people wear around their necks or dangle from their earrings. Okay? Somebody once told me that the amount of gold that's been unearthed on our planet is only just enough to fill, I think, 2 Olympic swimming pools. Okay? So it's a pretty precious and pretty rare element. Okay? We don't just give you a big lump of gold to gnaw on. Okay? It's not like that. So the gold salts basically have been refined to make them capable of being administered to patients either as an oral dose or as a IV dose. And basically the effects of gold, we're not quite sure how it works, but it's a similar kind of effect to silver. We use silver dressings on patients. Why would you use a silver dressing on a patient? It has an antibacterial effect. Why? It disrupts enzymes, but why? We're not quite sure. Gold's a similar thing with your immune system. For whatever reason, gold seems to alter the immune system, and it seems to slow it down, and it seems to suppress it. It doesn't work instantly, okay? But it seems to have an anti-inflammatory effect. It takes a long time to work, months. Okay, it accumulates in your tissues, and it seems to have this effect where it switches off white blood cells. It slows them down. Yeah, that's a good question. Will they be expensive? They probably are very expensive medications. Okay, some of the drugs that we give to patients are ridiculously expensive. Okay, but the cost versus the benefit plus the cost versus the long-term effects of disease processes sometimes make it, even though you're giving a drug to a patient that might be $15,000 a shot, and you've got to be careful you don't drop that ampule, okay? It might well keep the patient out of hospital and keep them healthy, so we'll save you hundreds of thousands of dollars down the line. Okay, so that's how they kind of work the economics of this kind of stuff out. So, slow, but seems to work. Okay, can accumulate in your tissues, can therefore have an adverse effect on things like your kidneys that have to sort of shift this stuff around, okay, and your liver that has to detoxify. So you need weekly injections. Some of these oral tablets are being produced now. Side effects for everything. If anybody asks you what's the side effect of a drug, always put nausea, vomiting, okay, and diarrhea, because generally speaking, every single drug in the compendium of drugs has those side effects. All right, gold being no different. All right, other DMARDs. Now this diagram is an eyesight test, so you won't be able to read it from there. So we'll just go through them. Now, remember, these are weird and wonderful drugs, okay? You don't need to know the complexities of hydrochloroquine sulfate. You just need to know it's a DMARD. It's also used as an anti-malarial drug, okay? So some of you have been out into the wild, into different countries where malaria is a problem. You will be taking some of these as well. We've noticed that it has an effect on your immune system and on inflammatory processes. So it's an anti-inflammatory medication, okay? And you'll see people and you'll be looking at them and you'll be going, why is this person on an anti-malarial drug when they've got rheumatoid arthritis? And it's not because its effects on malaria, it's because of its effects on the immune system. All of these DMARDs have some kind of effect on your immune system, basically, and it's your immune system that kicks off and controls the process of inflammation. And it's the inflammation, particularly within the joints of people with rheumatoid arthritis, that's causing the problem, the damage, the pain, etc., etc. So if we can suppress, change, limit, some way reduce your immune response, then you will have a positive effect on the inflammatory processes that go on in these autoimmune type diseases. However, as I am sure you all now recognize, if I suppress your immune system, there's going to be consequences to me suppressing your immune system. Okay? So these drugs are good for inflammation, but not always good for other processes that your body has to do to maintain health. So you have a cost benefit that you've got to weigh up. And that's why you've got to know that these drugs will have an effect on your immune response. Therefore, you need to think about what will that mean for your patient, particularly if they come in and they're sick because they've got infection. Yeah.
What if you make some of these drugs, rheumatoid arthritis, but at the same time they have kind of like a serious infection?
Yep.
Would you be giving them immunodependence or not?
It's a good question. So if you know somebody's got infection, then would you? So this is the call you have to make with your medics. Okay. In some cases, if it's a mild infection with few symptoms and signs, you might tolerate it and carry on because you know the flare-up of the rheumatoid is really bad. Other cases, this infection could be potentially life-threatening. So therefore, you want their immune system to work to get rid of it. So that's where you then start to stop giving them the therapies, and that's where they then get worse with the rheumatoid, and now you've got all those issues to deal with. Yeah. No, as you said, because they're usually a slow process to develop, they knock out your immune system, so your immune system is going to take a while to recover. So with all of these drugs, they're not instant fixes, the majority of these things, and they will influence your immune function. And as soon as you stop them, it's not instantly after 10 minutes it's going to recover, but your immune capability and your red bone marrow and the way you maturate and make these white blood cells, and we'll do all this next week and the week after, means that you can get some recovery reasonably quickly, but not instant, okay? So it's something we'd be aware of. So these generally we will give to people who are pretty well, okay? and we're trying to control the rheumatoid disease process. That's what we're trying to do with this. If people get sick, just like people with chemotherapy, which again we'll start covering next week, you have to then think, well, do I need to stop these drugs? Do these things need to pause whilst they recover? Okay, same thing with cancer drugs. We might have to stop those for a while whilst people recover. Okay, otherwise we'll kill them with the drugs that we're treating their other disease with. So lots of different types. So basically the anti-malarial one reduces inflammation. The penicillamine drugs suppresses your B cells. B cells, we'll go through next week, are part of your white blood cell system. They are part of your lymphatics or your lymphocyte system, and they produce things like antibodies. It's the antibodies that cause the problem in things like rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, cyclosporin is a broad spectrum immunosuppressant. You'll see people that have had organ transplants on things like immunosuppressants like this stuff. So this is a potent one. We tend to give it at quite low dosages. Okay, again, we'll talk more about organs and stuff like that next week, but that's quite a potent one. And what that cyclosporin does is it affects cell division. Okay, suppresses your immune system. Azathioprine is another one that affects cell division. Cells that rapidly divide are things like cancer cells. So some of these are anti-cancer drugs. Cells that rapidly divide are things like your immune cells, because when your immune system kicks off, it makes lots of copies of itself so it can formulate a response. We'll go through this next week. Okay, so more DMARDs. Methotrexate is a cancer drug. We give it as a low dose for people with rheumatoid arthritis. Methotrexate's effects are basically to reduce cell division. Now there are lots of other cells in your body that need to divide. Every second you destroy around 3.5 million red blood cells. Okay? Every second you have to replace 3.5 million red blood cells. If you can't make those things that you're breaking down, you're going to have a problem. So cancer drugs, drugs that we use for rheumatoid arthritis, can give you effects on other systems. You slough off the lining of your gut every 48 to 72 hours. A big proportion of your poo is gut lining. Okay? You have to replace your gut lining, otherwise you ain't going to live for very long. So these drugs, as with the cancer drugs, can have quite potent effects on other systems in your body. So methotrexate is another very good anti-inflammatory immunosuppressant drug, but it's got its side effects. Okay? Sulfasalazine, similar type of system that you're reducing the inflammatory processes by dampening down your immune response. The release of cytokines, substance P, prostaglandins, interleukins, all these other things, chemical soup. Okay? Net effect, positive for somebody with rheumatoid arthritis. You reduce the inflammation, you reduce the pain. Tumor necrosing factor alpha. Oh God, it just carries on. DMARD. Reduces, okay, or it causes effects on your body. If we can kind of reduce that process, we can start to reduce the damage and the inflammation that comes about from it. So the antagonists, these different types of adibulamabs, okay, these are all antibodies. You'll have seen now there's a lot more research going into basically making designer drugs and using antibodies to target things like cancer cells and target cells in your body. There's even now, just released last week, I was reading something about a system that's genetically designed, takes your white blood cells, they take them to a lab, they reprogram them genetically to find certain types of cancer, and then they put them back in your blood. And then they go around your body, make lots of copies of themselves, and they find that cancer and they kill it off. So we're moving towards that. We're using your immune system, and we're using antibodies to target your immune system so you can fight autoimmune disorders. It's all rather confusing. Okay? We'll go through some of this next week as well. So, rheumatoid arthritis. Problem, common, autoimmune, inflammatory disease, joint damage, pain, inflammation. Normal drugs, steroids, anti-inflammatories, great, work in mild forms. If the disease carries on, we use disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs. Weird and wonderful, lots of different types, lots of different effects. Main mechanism of action is to in some way suppress, alter, reduce your immune response and your inflammatory response. Okay? You need to monitor patients closely that are on those types of drugs, because there's lots of adverse effects from those types of drugs. They should be seen by specialists regularly. We should monitor things like their renal function. We should look at them. We should make sure they're well fed and watered. Blood pressure's good. Perfusion's good. Okay? That they've not got any issues with things like peeing, and the kidneys are shutting down, etc., etc. Our job is to pick up the changes that can occur from those types of drugs. They're more prone to infection, so you look for signs of infection. Okay? Make sense? All right. Other things that we'll see are things that you might have had these yourself. Tendinitis, bursitis. So these are the structures in and around joints. So the tendons and the ligaments are the bits that hold the joints together. The tendons attach a muscle to a bone. If you tear it, damage it, stretch it, gets inflamed, gets painful, you've got a problem. If you damage the bursa underneath the tendon, gets inflamed, you can get a problem. Problems that cause it: repetitive injury, sports, occupational stuff, repetitive strain, that kind of stuff, and aging, unfortunately. We've all got that to look forward to. So, just a couple of pictures. The blue ones on the knee are just to show you where the bursas are around your knee, because people aren't sure what a bursa is or where it is. Okay, so that's just so you can see where these things. So they're like a cushioning effect. They help things move around, slide over each other. Okay, so they can get trapped, damaged, inflamed. We need to use anti-inflammatory drugs. The other thing we do is this thing. Remember this? RICE. Rest, ice, compression, elevation. That's just to show you how this works. Okay, so rest obviously stops the movement of the joint. Ice reduces blood flow and reduces hyperemia and inflammatory response. Compression, wrapping the area, can reduce blood flow, inflammation, all that kind of stuff. Okay, elevation, you drain more effectively, get rid of some of the stuff that can cause inflammatory changes. Gout, we mentioned I think last week. Not very common, something you might see that's out there. Basically, gout is a condition where you can't get rid of these, so uric acid, uremic condition. So normally you change this uric acid, you get it into your urine, you pee it out, job's good. With some people, they lack the pathway to convert uric acid, and therefore it builds up as crystals in joints, and particularly for whatever reason, tends to like the big joint of the big toe. So you'll get, and you can see that picture very well, but they're big crystals in the joints which cause loads of inflammation and swelling in the joints. Okay? How do we deal with it? Well, basically, lifestyle changes later on, but acutely, stop the pain, stop the inflammation, so we use the painkillers, the anti-inflammatories, the steroids. There are different drugs that you can use which can actually help you to convert this uric acid and get rid of it out of your system. Interestingly, I had somebody who overdosed on colchicine about 4 weeks ago, and I didn't realise that once you get above a certain level of colchicine in your blood, it's 100% fatal. So this is something you wouldn't even think about, okay? And this guy was just below the threshold and survived. But any more than that, if he took another strip, and he didn't take it intentionally, he took it because his gout was playing up. So he just kept scoffing these colchicine tablets down, thinking it would help him out, not thinking there'd be any adversity to that. And then he ends up on a hemofilter in an intensive care unit. All right. Nerves. Probably felt some of these this morning. I'm not talking about those types of nerves. I'm talking about the ones that supply signal. Nerve pathways. Now, you'll have done all this before, hopefully, have you? Just nod, make me feel happy. Talks about nerves, nerve pathways, nerve signaling, cell bodies, dendrites, synapses, all that kind of stuff, movement of electrolytes, flow of things like sodium, calcium. Yes? Neurotransmitters? Yeah? Alright. So, nerve, when we're talking about nerve supply, what we're talking about, you've got basically afferent and efferent signals. Afferent basically taking something to, and efferent taking something away. So your brain's got pathways for signaling. One of those pathways allows you to move things around, motor pathways. Some are sensory pathways, so you can send signals about pain, for example. Now, we might want to manipulate some of those pathways. Okay? We want to manipulate how your nerves work. So in some cases, we can do that because we want to create things like war. Don't know if you remember a guy called Saddam Hussein. And there was this theory about Saddam Hussein that he had something called weapons of mass destruction. And part of the weapons of mass destruction we thought that he had was something to do with a nerve agent. Okay? A nerve agent that you can give as basically a chemical nerve agent to people to kill them. What nerve agents generally do, and this is how they work in a hospital as well, is they stop the signal along the nerve pathway. If I give you enough of this stuff, then I can basically paralyze all of the nerves in your body that control things like, voluntary movements. Okay? There are drugs that will knock out all the other pathways as well, but when we knock you out and we put you to sleep with an anesthetic, for example, when I want to do an operation on you, I give you 3 things in an anesthetic. One of those things is a nerve agent. Okay? And the job of the nerve agent is it doesn't put you to sleep. It doesn't create pain relief either. All it does is it stops your muscles from being able to move. So you're paralyzed. Now, part of the general anesthetic is we want you to be unconscious because we don't want you to be aware of that. And I don't also want you to have a physiological pain response when I start slicing through your tissues because you release adrenaline, noradrenaline, you've got all other things going on. Okay? But the nerve paralysis means that when I cut through a muscle, normally a muscle will guard. It will go into spasm when you damage it. You don't want that in surgery. So you relax the muscles by stopping the nerves working. Okay? The other thing sometimes is I want to relax the muscles around your airway, and particularly in your larynx and your vocal cords, so I can pass a tube through the vocal cords so I can control your breathing. So we'll paralyze you to do things like intubate you. Okay? We don't want it to last forever, so we give you usually short-acting nerve agents. Old Saddam was going to, well, we thought, was going to rain down nerve agents that lasted for a good few hours. What they would do is they would depolarize your muscles, make all of your muscles go into spasm, so much so that nerve agents make people break the back. They go into spasm, and then they're paralyzed so they don't breathe. Okay, so if the spinal injury's not killed you, then the paralysis of your respiratory muscles does the job. You're fully awake. Doesn't knock you out. Okay, that's why we don't like people with nerve agents, sarin gas and all that stuff. In hospitals, we use different types, depolarizing and non-depolarizing nerve agents. Okay? So if you go into theatres, have you done your theatre placements yet? Next one. So some of you go into theatres, you'll see people going for surgery, you'll see the anaesthetist putting them to sleep, normally with stuff like propofol. You might have even had this yourself. They say count to 10, before you get to about 4, you're out. Okay, so that's the agent that knocks you out, makes you asleep, and then we give you the paralyzing agent which stops your breathing, stops the vocal cords from spasming. Okay, put the tubes into you. So, these are the muscle agents, paralyzing muscle agents, okay? So some work at the motor end plate. In other words, where the nerve comes into contact with the muscle, and they will block the release of neurotransmitters, which are the things that carry the signal across the synapse to the next nerve. Okay, and at the muscle bed, and they will stop the release of things like acetylcholine, okay, non-depolarizing muscle relaxants. So you go floppy and you're paralyzed. Common ones, will be stuff like pancuronium, rocuronium, okay, vecuronium. So these are the ones that I use in the critical care areas, quite commonly the rocuronium. All right. So it basically stops your breathing for about 20 to 30 minutes. Depolarizing ones, different type, work similar way on your nerve at the motor end plate, but this one makes you flood your synapses with all these different vesicles full of acetylcholine. So what you'll find when you give patients this, they start to twitch as they depolarize first. The signal goes everywhere, and then they stop moving. At that point, they're paralyzed. Now you can do whatever you want to them. Okay? Succinylmethonium is a common, well, it's the only depolarizing nerve agent that we use. Other things that we do to people, we give you, you might have had this yourself, local anesthetic. Okay, it's not magic, works on your nerves. It works on the nerve pathway, and it stops the propagation of nerve signal by interfering with things like sodium channels. So what we tend to do is we give you a local anesthetic topically into an area. Let's say we're going to stitch up your arm because you've been drunk and fallen over again. Okay, so we inject around the site where we're going to stitch, and what that does is it stops the nerves, the nociceptors in those sites, from sending signals by altering the flow of sodium. Okay, so it gives you a nerve blockade, and now we can stitch your skin up and you don't feel it. Right? You're still going to get the inflammation and stuff like that, you're still damaging things, but you just don't feel that sensation of pain because you've stopped the signal. Okay? Other ones that you'll see given to patients, you've probably seen people with epidurals and stuff like that in. Okay? Epidurals, generally speaking, will either have an opiate or an opiate and some kind of local anesthetic in it, bupivacaine or something like that, ropivacaine. And what those do is you've got two effects. You've got the analgesic telling your spinal cord in your brain everything's great, pain's not there anymore, and you've got the nerves being paralyzed in the central nervous system, basically within the spinal cord, so that they can't conduct the signal. So now you lose sensation, you can't move your legs very well. That's why we do all the dermatones and all that other stuff. Okay? So that's how the epidural types works, uses the similar kinds of drugs. If you give this into an intravenous drip, or you gave it as an injection, for example, then you can kill people. That's why local anesthetics are local. They have to go into the skin. Or if you've got something going through an epidural, it goes at the rate that it's meant to go at, no faster. I'll tell you a story. I had a patient once in a high dependency unit at night. I had a junior doctor, and I was fairly junior. I'd been qualified about 2 years. This patient was sick. And I said to this doctor, you need to come have a look at this guy, he's pretty sick, you need to have a look at him. He said, right, okay, we need to do this, 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 need antibiotics, need this, need this, need a fluid bolus, blah, blah, blah. So he sent me off, he said, Steve, go and get this stuff out of the cupboard, and I'll give him a bolus of fluid. We had 2 pumps, both exactly the same. One had his fluids running, so he's like his normal saline. The other had an epidural. The doctor turned up his epidural to 999 mils an hour and then left. So I came back, had about 5 minutes. I'm looking at this guy thinking, don't look quite right, this bloke. What's going on? I looked at his heart rate, which was dropping, and I looked at his respiratory rate, which was dropping, and then I looked at the pumps, and he turned up the wrong one. Just as I realised, he stopped breathing and went into a respiratory arrest. Okay? Luckily, there's a few people around. We managed to sort this guy out. He ended up getting intubated and put on a ventilator and all that stuff. And the next day was told, we had a couple of complications post-operatively. That's why you're on the ventilator. Moral of the story, make sure you check. Make sure people that you're letting touch your stuff know what they're doing. Okay? Because otherwise they'll kill your patient. And you'll get in the poo for it. Okay? So, luckily this guy survived. Lots of different types, lots of different actions, lots of different effects. Okay, anything you want to ask? Okay, I'll let you go home. Okay, guys online, is there anything you want to ask? Okay, no worries. I'll sign off then.